Good afternoon, everyone. Good to connect. So, if you guys are interested in the topic of fraud, I have somebody on here that you definitely want to hear from. Not necessarily on how to commit fraud, but anything as it relates to fraud, trends, prevention, what have you. But this is definitely a guy you want to hear from. I have Dave Maimon on. He's a criminal justice professor at Georgia State University. He's also the director of evidence-based cybersecurity research group. Dave came to the U.S. from Israel back in 2005, and he earned his PhD from Ohio State. In addition, Dave researches, writes, and consults extensively on the topic of fraud, and he's constantly bringing to the forefront activity that has taken place on the dark web. So, Dave, if you wouldn't mind, maybe to start out, if you can provide a little bit of background on yourself and how you got into this work.
Go Buckeyes, first of all. Thank you so much for having me on your show, Tony. I really appreciate it. Sure, I mean, I'm more than happy to talk about the background. My PhD is actually in sociology. Came here to the United States from Israel to pursue my PhD. Back then, when I pursued the degree, I was very much intrigued and interested in understanding the effects of the neighborhood within which you live in on your deviant outcome. So, homicide, suicide, juvenile delinquency, all these fun stuff. It was around that time that I was trying to figure out what to do because I didn't really like the work we were doing around neighborhoods, and then some of the professors in Maryland, where I started working, told me that there's a need for cyber criminologists. I mean, someone who will dive in and study cybercrime. Since then, in 2011, I've been conducting research in the area of cybercrime, studying things like hacking and the progression of hacking events, a lot of online fraud, of course. Folks' behaviors on Wi-Fi environments. So yeah, a lot of fun research, which allows me to discover things that nobody discovered before. Yeah. Discovering new types of fraud, new types of attacks, understanding how the criminals contemplate launching different types of fraud. It's fun because every time I see that, I feel like I'm the first investigator or the first sort of scholars who see that, and then I bring it to our community, and people love that. So
So Dave, I know you reference and you post up quite a bit about the dark web and different ways that you kind of go about doing your research. So talk a little bit about that. Also, some of the things that you're starting to see, maybe from a trend perspective, like what's happening in the world of fraud.
A lot is happening right now, and as I assume the audience and the listeners know, fraud is one of those areas which change quite often, and this is one of the reasons why I really like studying it. What we do in the context of fraud is really a lot. We run some research where we try to communicate with the fraudsters, not telling them that we're scholars, right? We pretend like we're victims, or we pretend like we're other fraudsters, and then we simply try to engage with them and try to figure out, how they respond to different verbal cues, different behaviors that we display on online environments. So this is really fun because when you sort of think about the progression of a criminal event or a fraudulent event, we as fraud fighters, we would definitely want to make sure that there are some red flags we provide to the people we're trying to protect. Yep. And once you study the progression of fraudulent event and you understand what the fraudsters are looking for and how you can sort of disrupt the event from progressing and from the criminals leaving with your money, it's important to study that. And so that's what we're trying to identify. We're trying to identify those cues that at the end of the day will deflect the offenders away, will give the victim or the target as much information about the fact that they are talking to a criminal, and then sort of refrain, sort of speaking from engaging. So we do a lot of field experiments in that area. But most of what we do is really immerse ourselves in the online underground world, where
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of fraud going on. Many fraudsters sell all kind of illicit commodities. Granted, what we see, um, it's not only fraudulent activity. We see also a lot of drugs and a lot of weapons being offered for sale. But our focus is definitely fraud. And on the online underground markets, what we see, are a lot of identities. We see a lot of compromised bank accounts, a lot of counterfeit money, a lot of fake passports, fake driver licenses, fake documents folks are producing in order to manufacture and create new identities. And pretty much everything you can think about in the context of the online fraud ecosystem.
Yeah.
Our advantage is the fact that we document everything we see. So we have a very large group of people right now working with us on this point. We sit on many channels, many markets, and we simply download the information to our computers on a systematic manner in order to really try and identify trends.
Gotcha.
This is how we, in 2020, identified the increase in the volume of um, unemployment benefits fraud. So we've seen, in March 2020, we've seen a lot of those identities being used to defraud states across the country. And we were talking about this, and we were producing maps, but back then nobody really listened. Unfortunately, a couple of months ago, we realized that the government lost $146 billion to this kind of fraud. So, but we were seeing all that along with SBA loan fraud.
Sure.
In 2022, we started talking about the check fraud and the check theft pandemic that we have in this country. And I don't know if I can say I'm proud to report, but I'll report that when we started talking about that, we got a lot of pushbacks from all the banks. Everybody was like, who's writing checks anymore? I mean, in early 2022, when I started talking about this, people were just laughing, saying nobody's writing checks. And we're at the beginning of 2023, and I know that check fraud is the number one fraud that financial institutions around the country are looking at right now. So we started talking about it, and we still see that growing. That's the sad part. We still see check theft and check fraud and check forging growing. We actually are seeing the market we've seen in mid 2021 evolving into a beast, sort of speaking. So there's a lot happening there. What we also see right now in terms of a trend and developing trend is the creation of drop accounts. Drop back accounts is kind of huge right now, and based on our conversations with the financial institutions, they definitely begin to feel it. What we see is more and more actors, more and more criminals in the online underground markets using identities which they were able to grab from the checks they stole a couple of months ago to open new bank accounts and age them under fictitious identities, of course. And at some point, they simply start using them in order to deposit checks, in order to funnel transactions from other types of illegal activities that they're involved in. Washing money, laundering money, all this.
Are you seeing this type of activity? I mean, are these groups and networks here in the U.S. or are they coming in from overseas? Like, where is this type of activity primarily taking place? If you have some insight into that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think when we thought about fraud in the past and we thought about stolen identities in the past, what we had in mind was essentially the Russians or the Chinese or the North Korean using the identities they were able to obtain from a recent data breach that happened at Target or whatever. They simply went to the dump, took a few identities, and then started working with them. What we're seeing today is really not that, right? I mean, that, of course, happens, and there's a lot of it. But I think that what drives what we're seeing right now are a lot of local actors, local gangsters, who figured it out, right? I mean, they were able to take all the identities. They are able to take all the identities from the checks, from other sort of platforms. The identities are being offered for sale, and they're using them to steal money, to establish credit lines, to take loans on behalf of victims. So most of what I'm seeing and what I'm looking at and what I'm studying is really domestic crime.
Yeah.
But that, in my view, at least since starting studying this issue in 2020, is what drive the huge increase in fraud that we're seeing in the ecosystem.
And Dave, I can just sort of attest to that. I mean, just the clients and the folks that I talk to sort of day in and day out, the banks and different financial institutions. I mean, they're certainly seeing it and they're feeling it. And a lot of times, to your point, it's it's the checks, even folks coming in where bad checks are getting passed through, and before you know it, the money is gone. It's out of the institution, and it's after the fact. So it's it's happening. It's local market stuff. It's not this these big ticket sort of data breaches like we've been used to in the past, like Target and the others that we've seen. So interesting.
I agree, and we warned everyone about this, because if you know how what you can get from a check. Once you have the check of a victim, you have everything you need to start taking money from the account. But not only that, use the identity to manufacture fake driver licenses. We know that these guys have tentacles in the form of insiders on all kind of credit bureaus and banks they work with. So you can get everything you can, right, about the victim. May it be a business or an individual, may it be a social security number or employment identification number. And then once you have all this information, you move on to this next step in the fraud, right? You start establishing credit lines and take the identities and ask for loans and open bank accounts. And it's kind of scary that we are seeing this is happening right now, and everybody is feeling it.
Yeah, no, it's again across the board. I think last week you and I were having a conversation, and you even referenced a situation out of I believe it was out of New Jersey, right, where somebody established an entity, right, that was housed sort of in the same building or same location as another entity that was there, and they basically just sort of changed or maybe dropped the Inc. or the LLC off, were able to establish new identity for a business and start transacting.
Listen, I mean, New Jersey right now is one of those hubs where we see a lot of fraud happening. And I think, again, what drives that is the fact that many checks have been disappeared from USPS mailboxes in New Jersey. So a lot of new businesses, fictitious businesses being established on the same addresses those existing businesses operate. Those businesses' names are being used for opening new bank accounts. Those businesses, and this is from last week. I mean, last week when we talk, we didn't have this knowledge. I mean, last week we were able to find a large number of checks, tax refund checks, which were sent from the IRS to the taxpayers,
right.
and many of those checks have been stolen. Not only that, based on some intelligence that we had looking into the checks and talking to some of the victims, the criminals were able to use some of the checks that the victims sent to the IRS trying to pay their taxes to instead convince the IRS. I mean, they open a new identity or a new address, convince the IRS to send them a tax refund. And the amount of checks we find is staggering. One of the check I can tell you was, and this is the first time I've seen it, was an IRS tax refund for the amount of $1.1 million. And so, New Jersey is one of those hubs where this is happening. And, at this point, I mean, all we have to do is just, continue to investigate to come up with better ways to really prevent and, I don't know if prevent is the right word at this point, but mitigate. I think some of the issues we are experiencing.
Other than New Jersey, Dave, what are some of the areas? What other states are you seeing activity rise in? Like, where do you think the exposure is?
We definitely see Florida. We see a lot of activity in Florida right now. We see New York, Pennsylvania is one of those states where we see a lot happening. Texas, California. Illinois is definitely one of those states we begin to see a lot happening. These are the major states where we see a lot of fraud. I think it's a combination. Again, we're talking about places where you have a lot of domestic actors who create problems, right? I mean, so in all those places I just mentioned, we know that there's a very high presence of gang activity, and with more money, the gang is able to grow, more and more. We know that they're able to purchase more guns and sponsor their operation, their drug-related activity with the money they're able to get from fraud. So those locations are definitely, one of I mean, the places where we see a lot happening right now. Washington is also one of those places, in Maryland, where we see some activity happening at this point.
Gotcha. How can we, fight against this? What are some of the things that you think should be happening around combating this type of activity? Obviously, you guys and the work you're doing helps to expose it. But what are some other things that you can shed some light on or share some insight on?
So from my experience, tell the truth, I mean, it's not only that we are able to understand it. We also reach out to victims and we try to prevent their victimization. There are a couple of news reports. Reporters like to sort of work with the victim in their story. So so they got some of the information from us in order to reach out to the victim and try to prevent their victimization. And one of the things we realized, both from the reporters as well as from our own operation, is that we can actually reach out to the victim before they become victims. If you see someone's checks out there and you give them a call and you tell them that, hey, I've seen your check, they are able to prevent the money from being taken from their bank account, and they're also able to place a freeze on their identity. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that there's a lot that could be done, but the state of mind of the industry and the way we are doing things needs to shift a little bit, change just a little bit. So we are used to do things after the fact.
Yeah.
We're used to prevent things or detect things and then try to block things from getting worse. I think what needs to be happening right now is we need to engage in a more proactive fraud prevention, and that means trying to find, because the information is there. I mean, if I find it, people can definitely work with us, and I can provide this information for them. They can be proactive about the way they prevent fraud. So, the state of mind, right, with respect to how to prevent fraud needs to change. We need to be more proactive. We need to make sure that we share information in order to make sure that the criminals do not score points, using the identities in different places. I think that's the most important thing at this point. Just, change the state of mind. If you do some cool things in the ecosystem, you can disrupt the old markets, and then you can potentially get rid of several types of frauds that we're seeing right now.
Well, Dave, this has been extremely interesting and extremely insightful. Dave, if somebody wants to get in touch with you or reach out or kind of find out more about what you're doing, how would they do that?
We're available on ebcs.gsu.edu.
Say that one more time, Dave.
Just ebcs.gsu.edu. That's our research group website. Look for us, and you'll be able to find our email addresses, telephone numbers. We're more than happy to engage.
Dave, this has been a great session. I appreciate your time, and